Here is something the supplement aisle will never admit. The average American household spent $62 on protein powder last month, another $40 on plant-based patties in a refrigerated box with a certified label and a carbon footprint disclaimer. And somewhere in between all of that spending, nearly every family in this country quietly lost the knowledge of how to feed itself from a vine on a windowsill. This is not a recent loss. It happened deliberately, over decades, and through the steady pressure of marketing, patent law, and a food industry that discovered long ago that the margin lives in the processing, not in the plant. Today we are going to walk through 12 plants, or in one remarkable case, 4 distinct foods from a single plant that the peer-reviewed record describes as matching or exceeding beef on protein, that cost pennies to grow, and that disappeared from the American kitchen, not because they stopped working, but because somebody got rich the day you forgot them. Pay close attention to number 1. Most people reading this have passed it in a grocery store, perhaps even grown it accidentally, and never knew what they were looking at. And when we reach number 7, the pea shoot in the window tray, there is a story tied to it about survival and restoration that does not come from a wellness blog. It comes from scripture and a physiological reality that nutritional science is only now beginning to name with precision. Stick with this to the end. The last item is not a plant at all. It is an argument, and it may be the most important thing on this list. Number 1. Winged bean seeds. In the 3rd chapter of Daniel, there is a quietly radical nutritional experiment hiding inside a royal court. 4 young men, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, request vegetables and water in place of the king's meat and wine. After 10 days, the text records that they appeared healthier and better nourished than those eating the royal rations. Scholars and theologians have long focused on the obedience in that passage. Nutritional scientists might want to focus on the legumes. The ancient record of legumes as a primary protein source is not limited to Daniel, the Charaka Samhita, the foundational text of Ayurvedic medicine, composed between the 6th century BCE and the 2nd century CE, catalogs dozens of legume preparations under the heading of building foods. Foods prescribed specifically for restoration after illness, or to sustain laborers through extended physical work. The Benchao Gangmu, Li Shizhen's 16th century Chinese pharmacopoeia, lists mung beans, soybeans, and black-eyed peas as medicinal staples for energy and organ support. 4,000 years of agricultural civilization arrived at the legume independently and placed it at the center of the diet. And then there is Psophocarpus tetragonalobus, the winged bean, grown across Papua New Guinea, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and East Africa for centuries, described in a 2020 peer-reviewed review in the journal Legume Science as, and this is their language, a future superfood owing to its high protein, fat, and micronutrient content and its adaptability to various agroecological conditions. The mature seed of the winged bean contains approximately 29 to 35 grams of protein per 100 grams. Lean beef sits at 21 grams. The winged bean seed, gram for gram, outperforms the cow. The seed also contains linoleic acid, a polyunsaturated fatty acid, at concentrations that researchers compare favorably to soybean. A 100 gram serving provides significant quantities of calcium, iron, and the full range of essential amino acids, something most single plant foods cannot claim. Here is the preparation detail that matters most, and that almost no Western cooking guide mentions. Winged bean seeds must be cooked fully. They contain trypsin inhibitors in their raw form compounds that interfere with protein digestion. Boiling for 45 minutes at a full rolling boil deactivates these inhibitors completely. Soaking overnight first reduces the boil time to 30 minutes and improves digestibility further. Some traditional preparations in Papua New Guinea involve roasting the dry seed in an iron pan until the skin cracks and blisters a low moisture, high heat method that also neutralizes the inhibitors while producing a nutty, deeply savory flavor. The roasted seed, salted lightly and eaten whole, is a protein delivery system that costs roughly $4 for a packet of 30 seeds that will produce enough vine to feed a household through a growing season. The science is still developing on several of the winged beans' secondary compounds, but on protein density alone, the record is not ambiguous. The researchers knew, the universities knew, the plant just didn't fit the commodity market. Number 2. Winged bean leaves the greens. We are staying on the same vine, because that is the first thing to understand about the winged bean. It is not one crop. It is 4 crops growing simultaneously from one root, one soil, one planter box on one windowsill. The leaf is the first harvest, and the leaf is arguably the most overlooked. In the Ebers Papyrus, the Egyptian medical text dating to approximately 1550 BCE and one of the oldest surviving pharmaceutical documents in the world, leafy plant preparations appear in dozens of formulas. The specific plants shift by region and era, but the principle is consistent. The leaf of a leguminous plant, consumed regularly, was understood to support what Egyptian physicians called the strength of the blood. We now understand some of the biochemistry behind that intuition. The winged bean leaf, specifically, contains vitamin A in concentrations that run from 200 to as high as 800 international units per 100 grams, depending on the leaf's maturity at harvest. That is not a small number. The United States recommended daily intake of vitamin A for an adult sits at 700 to 900 micrograms RAE, the equivalent of roughly 300 to 3,000 international units. A handful of winged bean leaves covers the daily requirement and then some. Across Southeast Asia, these leaves have been harvested and consumed like spinach for centuries. Filipino and Indonesian home cooks cut the tender tip growth, the youngest 4 to 6 inches of each shoot, every few days, the way a Western gardener might trim basil, without ever stopping the plant's production. In parts of East Africa, the leaves are dried and powdered and added to soups and porridges to fortify the protein content of an otherwise starch-heavy meal. The Legume Science Review notes thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, B6, folate, and vitamin C in the leaf alongside the vitamin A, a micronutrient profile that makes a commercial multivitamin look pale. The preparation is simple, and the precision matters. Young leaves under 2 weeks old, still, bright and flexible, can be added raw to salads or lightly wilted in a pan with oil and garlic for 60 seconds. Older leaves develop tannins and a slight bitterness that requires brief blanching in boiling water for 2 minutes. Then draining and pressing. Do not overcook. Heat above 85 degrees Celsius for more than 5 minutes begins degrading the vitamin A content measurably. Wilt, drain, press, and serve. Western commercial bean breeding from the 1930s forward selected for pod yield and dropped leaf palatability entirely off the breeding list. If you cannot sell the leaf in a bag, you do not breed the plant to produce a good leaf. An entire food was rendered invisible in a single generation of agricultural selection. The leaf did not change. The market did. Number 3. Winged bean pods. Still the same vine. The third harvest, Dioscorides, the 1st century Greek physician, whose work Materia Medica remained the foundational pharmacological text in Europe for over 1,500 years, wrote at length about leguminous pods as foods of restoration, specifically recommending immature pods eaten fresh as gentler on digestion and richer in available nutrients than the mature dried seed. He was working from observation, not from a laboratory. But his recommendation aligns with what modern nutritional analysis confirms: the immature winged bean pod, harvested at 3 to 4 inches and eaten fresh or lightly cooked, delivers protein at levels significantly higher than any common supermarket green bean. The winged bean pod averages 4 to 5 grams of protein per 100 grams fresh weight, against common green beans at 1.8 grams, across Papua New Guinea and the Philippines. The young pod is eaten raw, stir-fried with garlic and oil, or added to soups and curries in the last 5 minutes of cooking to preserve texture. The pod has 4 flanged ridges running its length, hence the name, which gives it a distinctive appearance and a crisper texture than a standard bean pod. Children eat them raw off the vine. The flavor is often described as somewhere between a snow pea and a green bean. Mild and fresh, with a slight nuttiness that deepens with brief cooking. Here is what makes this economically remarkable, and what the Legume Science Review flags specifically: the same vine that produces the leaves you have been harvesting every few days will begin setting pods approximately 8 weeks after planting. You do not stop harvesting leaves to get pods. Both come simultaneously. And the more pods you harvest at the young stage, the more the vine produces, leaving pods to mature for seed, while continuing to harvest young pods from other parts of the vine, is standard practice in Sri Lankan and Indonesian subsistence gardens. 1 vine, 1 planter box, a south-facing window. The pod harvest begins at 8 weeks and continues for months. The research literature uses the word underutilized to describe this crop 14 times in a single review paper. Underutilized is the polite academic word for the market did not want it. So nobody put it in your hand. Number 4. Winged bean tubers. Almost nobody knows. And now the 4th harvest, from the same root system. If you allow the winged bean vine to run a full growing season in a container at least 12 inches deep, it will develop a cluster of starchy tubers, underground, fleshy, cream-colored, roughly the size and shape of a small Jerusalem artichoke. These tubers contain 7 to 10 grams of protein per 100 grams. That is nearly 5 times the protein content of a standard white potato. In Papua New Guinea, where the winged bean has been cultivated for centuries, the tubers are dug at the end of the season, washed, and boiled whole until tender, approximately 25 minutes in salted water, then eaten alongside the seeds and leaves from the same plant. The texture is closer to a water chestnut than a potato, denser, slightly sweet, with a clean starchiness that absorbs broth and spice well. They can also be sliced thin and roasted in a 400-degree Fahrenheit oven for 20 minutes until the edges caramelize. The international development world in the 1970s had every opportunity to promote this crop. There was genuine scientific interest. A National Academy of Sciences report from 1975 specifically highlighted the winged bean as one of the most promising underutilized crops on the planet, calling its nutritional profile exceptional and its adaptability to tropical and subtropical conditions remarkable. The report went largely unimplemented. The research money and the development funding kept flowing to cassava, potato, and maize crops that already had established commodity markets, existing processing infrastructure, and global distribution networks. A crop with no commodity market has no lobby. A crop with no lobby gets filed under underutilized and left there. The tuber does not require refrigeration for several days after harvest, in a root cellar or cool pantry. It keeps for 2 to 3 weeks, saved whole and replanted. It regenerates the vine the following season. 4 foods: 1 vine, 1 planter box, 1 packet of seed. We now move to the plants that stand alone. Number 5. Mung beans. In the Ayurvedic tradition, the mung bean Vigna radiata holds a specific designation that has no direct equivalent in Western nutritional language. It is called a tridoshic food, meaning it is considered to support all 3 constitutional types without imbalance. The Karaka Samhita recommends cooked mung bean preparations specifically during convalescence, fever, and digestive recovery, not as a supplement to healing, but as the primary restorative food. The same clinical intuition appears in the Benchao Gangmu, where mung beans are listed under foods that clear heat and support the liver, a description that modern researchers studying the bean's flavonoid content find surprisingly precise. What the Ayurvedic physicians were observing across centuries of practice, and what the Chinese medical tradition documented independently, is that the mung bean is unusually gentle on digestive function while remaining protein-dense. Modern analysis confirms approximately 24 grams of protein per 100 grams of dry bean. More importantly for sprouting, the germination process over 3 to 5 days transforms that protein's bioavailability. Research published in the Journal of Agricultural and Food Chemistry has shown that sprouting mung beans increases free amino acid content by as much as 40% and reduces phytate content, a compound that binds minerals and reduces their absorption by approximately 25% compared to the dry seed. You are not just growing a bean. You are enzymatically upgrading its nutritional architecture. Sprouted mung beans average 3 grams of protein per 100 grams fresh weight. But a reasonable serving of cooked and pressed sprouts reaches 300 grams easily, delivering 9 to 15 grams of protein from a jar on a shelf that cost roughly 40 cents in dry bean. The preparation is exact. Soak a half cup of dry mung beans overnight in cold water, a full 8 hours minimum. 12 is better. Drain through a square of cheesecloth, secured with a rubber band over the mouth of a wide-mouth mason jar. Prop the jar at a 4-5 degree angle, inverted, so air circulates and residual water drains. Rinse twice daily, morning and evening, with fresh cold water and drain fully each time. In 3 to 5 days, you have a jar full of crisp white sprouts. Cook them 2 minutes in a hot pan or 3 minutes in boiling water. Raw mung sprouts are safe from a clean home jar with proper rinsing. But cooking improves protein bioavailability further and eliminates any residual risk if your rinsing schedule slips. Dry mung beans run approximately $2.50 per pound. A pound of Beyond Meat was last listed at $8.29, most grocery chains. The protein per dollar is not close. It never was. Number 6. Lentils. Esau sold his birthright for a bowl of lentil stew. Genesis 25. The text is not endorsing the trade, but it is telling you something about lentils, that in the ancient Near East, they were considered worth trading for. Not a peasant's desperation food, a food of value. The Islamic Hadith literature includes a tradition attributed to the Prophet Muhammad that specifically mentions lentils as a food that softens the heart and produces tears of mercy, language that modern readers might dismiss as purely metaphorical, but that traditional Islamic medical commentators understood as referring to the lentils' physical effects on the body: warming, grounding, strengthening of constitution. Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, the 11th century text that served as the primary medical reference in both the Islamic world and medieval Europe for 5 centuries, classifies lentils under strengthening foods and recommends them cooked with vinegar to improve digestibility, a preparation note that aligns with modern research on how acidic environments improve lentil protein absorption. Dry red, green, or brown lentils contain approximately 24 to 26 grams of protein per 100 grams. They sprout faster than almost any other legume within 48 hours of rinsing and draining. Using the same mason jar method described for mung beans, green and brown lentils produce short, nutty sprouts that taste nothing like the raw seed. The sprouting process reduces the lentils' considerable tannin and phytate load significantly, improving both mineral absorption and digestibility. The preparation note that most sprouting guides omit rinse lentil sprouts in cold water for 30 seconds before eating or cooking. Lentils release a slightly slimy compound from their seed coat as they germinate, not harmful, but texturally unpleasant if not rinsed clear. After rinsing, eat raw in salads, or cook for 3 minutes in a hot oiled pan until lightly golden. They hold their shape better than mung sprouts and carry a denser, more savory flavor. A cup of sprouted lentils in a grain bowl reads to the palate like something much more substantial. A pound of dry lentils runs approximately $1.79 at any grocery in the country. On protein per dollar, lentils consistently place among the top 3 foods on the planet by every calculation the nutritional economics literature has run. That is not a secret. It is just what everyone forgot to mention. If this kind of ancient knowledge resonates with you, hit like and subscribe, because what's coming next goes even deeper. Number 7. Peas from dry seeds. There is a story in 1 Kings 19 that does not get nearly enough attention in the context of human physiology. The prophet Elijah has just performed one of the most dramatic acts in the Hebrew scriptures. He has called down fire on Mount Carmel, humiliated the prophets of Baal. And then, in a sudden collapse of energy that reads in the text as something very close to what we would now call adrenal exhaustion, he runs for his life into the wilderness and collapses under a broom tree. He tells God he is done, that he wants to die. Then he falls asleep, and an angel touches him twice, each time with the same words, "Arise and eat." The food provided is described as a cake baked on hot coals, a flatbread, and a jar of water. Elijah eats, he sleeps again, he is touched again, he eats again. And then the text says he rose and walked 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb on the strength of that food. That is not poetry. That is a description of metabolic restoration. Researchers who study glycogen depletion in endurance athletes will recognize the physiological sequence: complete exhaustion, sleep, complex carbohydrate intake, further sleep, and then sustained energy over an extended period. What the text describes as a cake baked on coals in the ancient Near Eastern context would almost certainly have included legume flour or whole grain, with possible incorporation of dried legumes, preparations that combine slow-releasing carbohydrates with amino acids in a ratio that modern sports nutrition calls ideal for glycogen resynthesis without blood sugar spike. The pea Pasum sativum enters this story at the germination stage. Dry peas contain approximately 23 grams of protein per 100 grams, but the pea shoot, the young growing tip of a sprouted pea plant, cut at 3 inches, carries 4 to 5 grams of protein per 100 grams of fresh green tissue, along with vitamin C concentrations that rival bell peppers, folate at levels meaningful for cardiovascular support, and a chlorophyll density that researchers at Tufts University have linked to improved iron absorption in elderly populations who eat them regularly. The pea shoot is grown on a shallow tray of potting soil. Broadcast dry peas densely across the surface they should nearly touch. Mist with water and cover the tray, with a second tray inverted on top for 3 days to simulate darkness and encourage germination. Uncover and place in a south-facing window with 6 hours of indirect or direct light. Mist daily to keep the soil surface consistently moist but not waterlogged. In 10 to 12 days, cut with kitchen scissors at the soil line. One tray the size of a piece of printer paper, roughly 8 by 11 inches, will produce 200 to 300 grams of pea shoots. That is 10 to 15 grams of protein, a full day's vitamin C requirement, and a plate of greens that taste of spring sweet, bright, slightly grassy. Cost a $1. 60 bag of dry peas. Time, 5 minutes of attention per day. Elijah arose and ate, and walked 40 days. The strength of simple food, properly prepared, was never in question. Number 8. Chickpeas. The chickpea appears in the archaeological record from Neolithic sites in present-day Turkey and Syria, dating to approximately 7 BC. It appears in the account of Boaz instructing Ruth to eat roasted grain at his table, a scene from the Book of Ruth that scholars of ancient Near Eastern agriculture note is consistent with the roasted chickpea preparation common throughout the region. By the time of Avicenna, chickpeas were sufficiently well understood medically that the canon of medicine distinguishes between white and dark varieties, recommending white chickpeas for building strength and dark ones for digestive conditions. Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century German abbess and naturalist, whose Physica remains one of the most important medieval European herbals, includes chickpea preparations in her recommendations for sustaining physical vigor during demanding work or travel. 5 traditions on 3 continents, across 3,000 years, arrived at the same conclusion about the chickpea it builds. Dry chickpeas contain 19 grams of protein per 100 grams, soaked for 48 hours, and sprouted for 3 days using the mason jar method. Their protein bioavailability increases significantly as enzyme activity reduces phytic acid and trypsin inhibitors, the same mechanism at work in mung beans and lentils. Sprouted chickpeas can be eaten raw when very young at 24 to 48 hours. when the sprout tail is barely visible, with a fresh, nutty flavor reminiscent of raw edamame. At 3 days, with a visible white tail of 1 centimeter, they should be cooked. The roasting preparation is the one that most of this century has forgotten, and that diasporic Middle Eastern communities in American tenements were still practicing in the 1920s on radiators and wood stove griddles. Drain sprouted chickpeas and dry them thoroughly on a clean cloth for 1 hour. Spread in a single layer in a dry cast iron skillet over medium heat. Stir constantly for 15 to 20 minutes until the skins crack and blister and the chickpeas produce a toasted nut de aroma. Add salt in the last 2 minutes. Remove from heat and allow to cool on the pan. The result is a snack food with the texture of a roasted nut. A protein density approaching 25 grams per 100 grams cooked weight. And a shelf life of 2 weeks in a sealed jar. No commercial processing required. The snack industry in the United States crossed $100 billion annually, somewhere around 2015. A bag of extruded corn chips is water. Refined starch. And margarine. A jar of roasted sprouted chickpeas is protein. Complex carbohydrate. And pennies. The USDA nutrient database says so clearly. The retail shelf just does not reflect it. Number 9. Soybeans. Hidden behind the commodity crop. The soybean glycine max appears in Chinese agricultural records under the designation one of the 5 sacred grains in texts dating to approximately 2800 BCE, attributed to the legendary Emperor Shennong. The Benchao Gangmu devotes considerable space to soybean preparations, distinguishing between the effects of raw, cooked, fermented, and sprouted forms in ways that modern fermentation science has since validated as biochemically meaningful. The same plant used differently produces measurably different nutritional and medicinal outcomes, a nuance that the commodity soybean complex, organized around bulk crushing and oil extraction, has no incentive to preserve or communicate. America grows approximately 94 million acres of soybeans in a peak year. More than any country except Brazil. Almost none of it ends up on an American plate in a form recognizable as a bean. It becomes feed grain for cattle. It becomes refined oil for frying. It becomes lecithin, isoflavone supplements, and the lipid base for processed snack foods. The commodity supply chain Cargill, Archer Daniels Midland. Bunge moves this bean through crushers and refiners at a scale that generates enormous profit. There is no version of that supply chain that makes money from you soaking a cup of soybeans in your kitchen. Soybeans sprouted at home, the same mason jar method. 5 days of twice-daily rinsing produce what Korean cuisine calls kongnamul firm, slightly translucent bean sprouts with a clean, grassy flavor used in soups, stir-fries, and bibimbap. The nutritional profile of soybean sprouts sits at approximately 13 grams of protein per 100 grams, significantly higher than mung sprouts, along with isoflavones at concentrations that several peer-reviewed studies have associated with favorable estrogen metabolism in postmenopausal women. With results researchers describe as worth continued investigation. One preparation note that is non-negotiable: raw soybean sprouts contain relatively high concentrations of trypsin inhibitors and hemagglutinin, compounds that inhibit protein digestion and cause gastrointestinal discomfort in their fictifistan, uncooked form, unlike mung sprouts, which can be eaten raw without significant concern. Soybean sprouts should always be cooked. 5 minutes in a hot pan or 3 minutes in boiling water is sufficient. The cooking step does not diminish the protein value. It makes it available. 94 millions acres. 1 jar. The distance between what this country grows and what it eats is not a food access problem. It is a knowledge problem. Number 10. Wheat. The wheat sheaf appears in Pharaoh's dream in Genesis 41, 7 fat heads of grain, and 7 thin, and Joseph's interpretation of that dream shapes agricultural policy for an entire civilization for 14 years. The Capitular the Vilis. The 9th century Carolingian imperial ordinance that governed agricultural production across Charlemagne's empire mandates the cultivation of wheat on every imperial estate, alongside specific preparation methods for royal table use. Wheat has been at the center of human civilization's caloric architecture for 10,000 years. What the industrial grain processing system has systematically removed from that 10,000-year relationship is the germ, and with the germ goes most of the wheat's nutritional density. Dry wheat buries the whole. Unprocessed kernel, including the bran and germ, contain approximately 12 to 13 grams of protein per 100 grams. That is lower than legume. But the combination becomes important. Wheat is high in the amino acid methionine, in which most legumes are limited. Legumes are high in lysine, in which wheat is limited. Eaten together in a single meal, a principle that nutrition textbooks still teach as complementary protein pairing, they produce a complete amino acid profile that matches animal protein delivery. Sprouted wheat achieved by soaking wheat berries for 12 hours. Draining and rinsing twice daily for 2 to 3 days until a small white tail emerges, converts a significant portion of the grain's complex starch into simpler sugars through enzymatic activity, which improves digestibility considerably. Simultaneously, the germination process increases the bioavailability of zinc, iron, and magnesium by reducing phytate content by approximately 50%. According to research published in Food Chemistry, the sprouted berry can be eaten whole chewy, mildly sweet, with a fresh grain flavor added to salads, or dried and ground into a flour called sprouted wheat flour that bakes differently than conventional flour denser, moister, with a naturally sweet note that requires less added sugar. The critical temperature detail: do not expose sprouted wheat to heat above 118 degrees Fahrenheit if you want to preserve the enzymatic activity that makes sprouted grain nutritionally distinct. Dehydrating in an oven on the lowest setting with the door propped slightly open keeps temperature below this threshold. Above it, the enzymes denature, and the sprouted grain becomes nutritionally closer to conventional cooked grain, still good, but no longer sprouted in the meaningful sense. The mill that takes your wheat berry and removes the germ to extend shelf life is making a commercial decision. The nutrition stayed behind in the part they discarded. Number 11. Corn. The corn zea maize is described in Mayan creation texts as the substance from which the first humans were made. The Popol Vuh, the Kach Maya cosmological account written down in the 16th century from an oral tradition that extends considerably further back, states that the gods shaped human flesh from white and yellow maize. This is not merely mythology. It is a statement about what corn meant to Mesoamerican civilization. It was the foundation of physical life itself. The traditional Mesoamerican preparation of corn involves nixtamalization, soaking dried kernels in an alkaline solution of water and calcium hydroxide (Cal), then washing and grinding the wet grain into masa. This process developed over 3,000 years of empirical refinement by indigenous, Mexican, and Central American peoples. Does something biochemically significant that the industrial corn industry still largely ignores. It liberates niacin vitamin B3, bound to the corn's fiber matrix, and makes it bioavailable. Corn eaten without nixtamalization provides minimal, usable niacin. Populations that adopted corn as a staple without adopting nixtamalization, notably in 18th and 19th century Europe and the American South, developed pellagra, the niacin deficiency disease, in epidemic numbers. The traditional knowledge was inseparable from the food's nutritional utility. Corn's protein content sits at approximately 9 to 10 grams per 100 grams of whole kernel, lower than legumes, similar to unprocessed wheat. But sprouted corn, dried corn kernels soaked and germinated for 2 to 3 days, using the same basic method, produces a sweeter, more digestible product with improved amino acid availability. More importantly, what corn represents on this list is the inflection point, Pioneer Hybrid, founded in 1926. Introduced hybrid corn varieties in the 1930s that dramatically outyielded open-pollinated varieties in the first growing season. The commercial logic was elegant and permanent. Hybrid seed does not breed true. The farmer who saves hybrid seed and replants it the following year gets scrambled genetics and inconsistent yield, so he buys again. Every spring. Forever. What applied to corn in the 1930s had, by the 1990s, extended through patent law to beans, tomatoes, and every major garden vegetable. The seed you save is now, in many cases, illegal to replant commercially. The knowledge of seed saving, the practice your grandmother performed as a matter of household economy, was rendered not just uncommon, but structurally undermined by a legal and commercial architecture designed to ensure annual purchase. Eli kept his seeds in glass jars on a wooden shelf, labeled in pencil on masking tape, the variety and the year. 1948 1961 1972 The jars outlasted him. Number 12. Potatoes. The potato appears nowhere in Scripture. It is a New World plant, unknown to the ancient Mediterranean, unknown to medieval Europe, unknown to the compilers of the Ebers Papyrus or the Benchao Gangmu. Its absence from the ancient record is itself part of its story. The potato arrived in Europe in the 16th century via Spanish colonial ships from the Andes. The Incas had been cultivating it at altitude for over 8,000 years. The Incan chuño, a freeze-dried potato preparation still made in the Bolivian and Peruvian highlands, involves a process of controlled freezing, trampling to remove water, and sun-drying that reduces the potato to a shelf-stable, protein-preserved form that stores without refrigeration for years. The technique is precise, temperature-dependent, and ancient exposure to nighttime temperatures of -2 to -4 degrees Celsius, followed by daylight sun exposure at altitude, produces a product with dramatically reduced moisture and concentrated nutrients. Colonial Spanish administrators recognized the chuño as a superior food preservation technology and used it to supply their own mining operations in the Americas. The potato's protein content is modest, approximately 2 grams per 100 grams cooked, but what it represents on this list is nutritional completeness per cost of land. Potatoes contain all essential amino acids in small quantities. Significant vitamin C before cooking degrades it. Potassium, B6, and a form of resistant starch after cooling that functions as prebiotic fiber, feeding beneficial gut bacteria in ways that warm-consumed potato does not. The cooling step is rarely mentioned in standard nutritional guidance, but it is physiologically meaningful. Researchers studying resistant starch formation confirm that cooking and then cooling potato before eating measurably increases its resistant starch content, with results for blood glucose management that several peer-reviewed trials describe as clinically relevant. The preparation precision that preserves the most nutrition: boil whole, with skin intact in salted water until just tender, approximately 20 minutes for medium potatoes. Do not peel before cooking. The skin acts as a barrier against vitamin C loss into the cooking water. Drain. Cool to room temperature, and consume cold or reheated gently below boiling. Avoid the microwave for reheating. If resistant starch formation is the goal, high microwave heat partially disrupts the crystalline starch structure that makes the resistant starch physiologically useful. The potato did not need an ancient scriptural anchor. It had 8,000 years of Andean cultivation and an empire's food supply system. What it needed, and what it still needs, is for the preparation knowledge to stay with the food. The nutrition is still there. The knowledge is what keeps disappearing. Every plant on this list was stripped of something by the time it reached you. The wheat lost its germ. The soybean became oil. The chickpea became a chip. The mung bean grew under fluorescent lights in a commercial warehouse until the FDA issued a salmonella advisory that scared half the country off mason jars forever. The winged bean never arrived at all, not because it failed to work, but because it could not be made into a commodity. It was too whole, too complete, too useful without the processing step that generates the margin. This is the unifying principle, and it runs through every item on this list without exception. The active compounds that make these plants do what scripture and traditional medicine spent thousands of years observing them do are, in nearly every case, located in the parts of the plant that commercial processing removes. or destroyed by the temperatures and pressures that commercial shelf life requires. The enzyme activity in the sprouted bean, the vitamin A in the leaf tip, the germ of the wheat, the resistant starch that only forms when the potato is allowed to cool, the niacin that only becomes available when the corn is nixtamalized in the traditional way. You cannot patent a clean mason jar. You cannot build a $7 billion company on a handful of dry lentils. You cannot charge $40 for a bag of something that grows on a windowsill in 10 days and tastes like spring. So the knowledge left, not all at once, not dramatically. It just quietly stopped being passed down. Stopped being taught in home economics classes that were themselves cut from school curricula starting in the 1980s. Stopped being mentioned in the nutrition guidance that shifted its attention entirely to the fortified and the processed and the measured. Here is the question worth sitting with after this video ends. If the ancient record and the modern peer-reviewed literature are arriving at the same conclusions about these plants, and they are, with increasing frequency and specificity, what does that say about the centuries of accumulated observation that produced the traditional knowledge in the first place? The Charaka Samhita was not running randomized controlled trials. Dioscorides did not have a mass spectrometer. What they had was generations of careful attention to what happened to people who ate certain foods in certain ways. That attention is a form of evidence. It is slow evidence. It is unpatentable evidence. But it is evidence nonetheless. If this kind of thinking is useful to you, share this video with someone who needs it. Leave a comment below. What did your grandparents grow or keep on a shelf that you have not seen in decades? The answer with the most comments shapes what we cover next. Like and subscribe if you want to stay on the ridge. There is more coming, and it is the good kind of stubborn,